Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's very good to be able to give this second lecture here at Helsinki. I'm going to talk about some themes that emerge from this book of mine called Why We Can't Stop Talking About Science, Faith and God. And what I want to do here is open up some questions about science and faith, and in some ways talk about my own intellectual journey from atheism to Christianity, and the ways of thinking about the relationship between faith and science that I've developed over the last 40 years. And in many ways, I'm just saying, look, here are some ideas I have found helpful. Do these help you in any way? So please see this as me offering you some ideas I have found helpful in the hope that they might also be of use to you. So the thing about the new atheism is they've discovered that they can be as rude about religion as they like, but people keep on talking about God. They keep on believing in God. And in this lecture, I want to look at some of the motivations that might lie behind that. So where shall we begin with such a wide topic? Well, I think we're going to begin with the sense of wonder that many of us experience when looking at the beauty of nature. And certainly in my own case, I can remember once back in the 1970s in Iran, making a journey across the desert at night by bus because it was far too hot to do it by day. And it was a very old bus, and the bus broke down in the middle of the desert, and we all got off while the driver tried to fix it. And the desert was silent, solemn, still, dark. And I looked up, and there was the night sky blazing with an intensity and a brilliance that I'd really never seen before. And I felt a sense of being overwhelmed by something astonishing. And I'm sure many of you could identify a moment when you've also felt that sense of wonder or amazement at something that you've seen in nature, sending a shiver of pleasure or something like that running down your spine. Now, of course, for some people, that sense of wonder, what Albert Einstein called rapturous amazement, is simply an end in itself. And the German poet Goethe just said, look, this is a wonderful experience, enjoy it. There's nothing behind it, there's nothing beyond it. But for most others, like the philosopher Aristotle, this sense of wonder, pharmazine, is all about a gateway. It's about alerting us to the fact that there is something behind what we observe and inviting us to go in there and begin to explore it. And it seems to me that this motivation of wonder is actually what drives the whole scientific enterprise. We find ourselves amazed by nature and want to try and understand it all the more. Thomas Aquinas talked about what he called a desiderium sciendi, a longing to know, a sense that there is something we're being drawn into, which offers us the possibility of intellectual stimulus. There's something here we want to know about. And the point I want to make is that this journey of discovery involves the reason, but also the imagination. It's not just about trying to be analytical. It's about trying to develop an imaginative vision, not imaginary, something we've made up, but imaginative, something we behold in our mind's eye. And that seems to me to be important. The Greek word theoria really means a way of beholding, a way of imagining the world. And that's really what a theory is. And I find myself entranced by this. It seemed to me that life is all about a journey in which we begin to transition, as the novelist Henry Miller rather nice puts it, not so much to a destination, but to a new way of looking at things. And that's what a good theory does. It gives you a new perspective, a new angle of vision. You see the same things as before, but now you see them in a new way. And in many ways, that's what science is very good at doing. It helps us to see things in a new way. But there are, I think, interesting questions here. And one of the points I want to make is, although I regard, and still regard, science as being wonderful, it has its limits. There are a lot of things it just doesn't help us with. And I'm going to be exploring some of those today. The British biologist Sir Peter Medawar, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine some time ago, talked about questions, I quote, that science cannot answer and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. And really he's getting at those questions which Karl Popper calls ultimate questions. Who am I? What is the point of life? Why am I here? And the point I want to emphasize is that if we begin to try and engage or answer those ultimate questions, we are not being anti-scientific, we're not being irrational, we're simply respecting the limits of reason and science and saying we've got to answer these questions, and if we have to go beyond what science can tell us, then that's what we're going to do. We look elsewhere for answers. Now, the physicist John Wheeler, who many of you will have read, is a very good writer, once talked about scientific observations, in effect, as yielding at the very most what he called an island of knowledge in the midst of an ocean of uncertainty. And the point he was making is that actually science only gives us sure knowledge of a relatively small area. And even there are uncertainties. And I think the question many of us will want to ask is, do we limit ourselves to what John Wheeler calls this island of knowledge? Or do we recognize that there are deep, important questions that may lie beyond this island of secure knowledge, which nevertheless are worth investigating and exploring? And in many ways, this is the theme I want to develop in this lecture. I want to affirm that science is great, but I also want to affirm that there are limits to what it can teach us. Any philosophy, any way of thinking is going to open up these deeper questions. And so I'd like to quote, if I may, from a Spanish philosopher, José Ortega, who makes these points, I think, very clearly indeed. This is Ortega reflecting on both the strengths and the limits of science. He writes, "Scientific truth is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched." And for Ortega, the great intellectual virtue of science is that it knows its limits. It has its methods that are tried and tested, and it gives results in certain areas and not in others. And what Ortega is suggesting in this passage is that there are big questions we want to ask, which actually lie beyond the scope of the scientific method when it is legitimately applied. He says we are given no escape from ultimate questions. In one way or another, they are in us, whether we like it or not. And again, the point he makes so clearly, scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete. So I talked earlier in this lecture about this sense of wonder. And of course, one outcome of this is science. But there's another outcome, and that is religious faith. When I was a young man, I saw the beauty of the world, and this led me into the study of science. But I have to say that this seemed to me to entail atheism, that you could not be a thinking person and a religious believer. Above all, you could not be a scientist and be a religious believer. And my view was quite simply that science is able to answer all the legitimate questions of humanity, and if a question is scientifically unanswerable, then it is simply not a proper question in the first place. And I have to say that when I remember my views about religion as a young man, I get all nostalgic in many ways, because when I read Richard Dawkins, I see those same ideas being repeated today, and it reminds me of what I used to think a long time ago. But I moved away from that. And I think one of the reasons I moved away from atheism was this. I gradually began to realize two things. One was that, if I can put it like this, the lens through which I looked at the world around me, my own experiences offered by atheism, didn't seem to give a very satisfactory, a very coherent view of reality. It seemed to be more about denials than about affirmations. And secondly, it also seemed to me that atheism rested on beliefs that simply could not be proved to be true. And in those days, I bought into this idea, science is about facts, but religion is about opinions or beliefs. But I think as I began to study the history and philosophy of science in my last year at high school, when I was about 17 years old, I began to realize that this just wasn't the case. I mean, let me give you a very obvious example. Many scientists would say it is a fact that the age of the universe is, well, you choose, 13.9 billion years. But of course, that is not a fact. That is a deduction from certain observations which are interpreted within a theoretical framework, such as the redshift giving us information about the speed of galaxies, the correlation between the speed of galaxies and the time it's taken for them to get to that point, which means that looking at all these observations through a theoretical lens, you come to this understanding of the age of the universe, but it's not something you observe, it is an interpreted entity. It is the interpretation of observations, not an observation in itself. And if those theoretical frameworks which lead to that age of the universe turn out to be wrong, then the age of the universe is wrong. The age of the universe is not a fact. It's an interpretation of observations, and it's an interpretation of observations that may change. And I think I began to realize, as I studied history and philosophy of science, a number of things. I'm just going to put two of them on the table this morning. Number one, that science rarely proves its theories. Much more, it is saying, of the various ways of explaining these observations, this one, at the moment, seems to be the best. There's a much greater humility to science than I had realized. And secondly, of course, and perhaps even more importantly, science is on a journey of discovery. And this means that what it believes today, it may not believe in a generation's time. And you might think, for example, of the massive changes in cosmology in the last century, where we moved from the idea that the universe has always been there to the idea that the universe came into being, a radical transformation, but one that is justified by the evidence now available. And as Michael Polanyi pointed out in that very powerful book, Personal Knowledge, this raises a very interesting question. The scientist believes a number of theories to be true on the basis of the evidence that's offered in their support, but he also knows that in 10, 20, 30 years, some of those will be shown to be wrong. And the difficulty is you don't know which ones they are. And that seems to me to be a soberingly realistic way of looking at things. So I left behind a scientific positivism. I began to realize atheism was actually a belief system, not fact, but an interpretation of the world. And I read books like Jerry Coyne, the American geneticist, recent book on faith and facts, and you just say, look, does this man realize how entangled theory and observation actually are? We need, I think, to move on beyond that. And what I discovered, at least I believe to be right, and still believe to be right, is that Christianity gives me a way of looking at things that makes far more sense of the world I see and the world I experience than my earlier atheism. Now, clearly that's a judgment on my part, but it's a judgment that over the years I have come to trust and love. So there are, I think, a lot of points to make here. My own discovery of this way of thinking really happened at Oxford University, when I began to study chemistry in detail and began to think about quantum theory, the history and philosophy of science, and began to realize how complex reality is and how science cannot be reduced to these simplistic slogans. Some of you may know the poem of T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets, in which he has these lines: "We had the experience, but we missed the meaning." And what Eliot is saying is that it's so easy to observe something and yet not appreciate how significant it is. And what he is pointing to is a need for some theory that allows you to see the world as it really is. And of course, that's an integral theme of the Christian gospel. In the New Testament, the Greek word metanoia, we translate that usually as repentance, is often used. But metanoia is about more than repentance. It's about developing a new way of seeing things. The word means a mental inversion, a mental flip. You see things one day, and then suddenly there's a transformation. You see them in a new way, which leads to a new way of action, a new set of attitudes, which of course is the Christian faith. It involves repentance, but it also involves seeing things in a new way. And you might think of those very famous words of Paul in Romans 12, where he advises his readers not to be conformed to the world, but to be transformed by the renewal of your minds. And I want to suggest to you that Christianity, whatever else it is, involves this renewal of the mind, in which you see things in new ways, right ways, deeper ways. And that seems to me to be a point that is really very important to make. So I gradually came to the view that the natural sciences fill in part of this big picture of reality, and there are other parts that are filled in by other areas, including, of course, the Christian faith. And one of the points I emphasize in this book is, look, we are human beings. That means we are meaning-seeking animals. That's what we need to keep going. We need food to keep going physically. We need a sense of meaning and identity and purpose to keep going as social and thinking animals. And Christianity gives us that way of thinking. It gives us much more. It gives us trust. It gives us an ethical system. But it also gives us this new way of seeing the world, including, of course, a new way of seeing the natural sciences. Now, you can imagine my intellectual turmoil. I was an atheist who had suddenly discovered atheism wasn't right, had embraced Christianity, and was trying to figure out how on earth I related my new faith to my love for science. And I think all of us know we need help when we're discovering a new field of study, which is immense and puzzling. And I was very fortunate to have such a mentor. I was an undergraduate at Oxford University, and I was an undergraduate at Wadham College. And one of the fellows of Wadham College was a man called Charles Coulson, who was Oxford's first professor of theoretical chemistry. He was also a well-known Christian writer and speaker, and one evening he spoke to us in College Chapel. And he spoke about how he understood the relation of science and his faith. And he gave, in that talk, a way of thinking about things which remains with me to this day. It's a way he had discovered, and he explained it. And it's the idea I explained in a lecture yesterday, which is the idea of multiple perspectives on reality. Coulson says when you look at a very complex building, or indeed a mountain, he was very fond of Ben Nevis in Scotland, which he regularly climbed. He said you can see this from many angles, and the different angles of view give you different insights into the nature of the mountain or the building. And the right way of seeing it is to bring all of these perspectives together. No one perspective is good enough. You need many, which you integrate into a big picture, which gives you the full detail. And I spoke to him for a few moments after his sermon, and that way of thinking still remains with me. And I want to make a point here, if I may. I was fortunate to learn from someone older and wiser, and we need those figures of wisdom, people who have assimilated science and faith, or other areas of their lives and their faith, and can help those who are now in their teens and 20s begin to do the same. We all need help with this. I think what you need to do is identify who those figures of wisdom are, so they can help younger people think these things through at a time of their lives when there is so much to think about, so much to take in, that most of us feel overwhelmed and confused. So that's my own story of journey. And since then, of course, I've spent a lot of my life thinking about how to bring science and faith together. And I want to just say that I found this to be intellectually enriching. It's been good for me to do this sort of thing, to develop this renewal of my mind, or as Jesus Christ says himself, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That discipleship of the mind seems to me to be very important. I know that very often church culture is anti-intellectual, but it doesn't need to be. We need people who think about their faith and can help others to do so as well. But it does raise some very interesting questions. Let me open up one for some reflection. Here is the question: are we meant to believe in God? Are we meant to believe in God? Now, whether you think Christianity is right or wrong, one of its core themes is that there is a homing instinct for God deeply embedded within human nature. This is very often articulated using that wonderfully subtle idea of the image of God. What does it mean to bear God's image, as we all do? Well, one line of interpretation is that it predisposes us to think of God naturally. Another is it predisposes us naturally to imagine God. In other words, to see God visually, not simply cognitively. But as many of you will know, the early church fathers were absolutely clear of how important this was. You may know that very famous prayer of Augustine of Hippo at the beginning of his Confessions, where he prays to God these words: "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And the point that Augustine is making is that human beings are spiritually restless. They are questing, they are seeking. They are not satisfied with what this created and transient world can deliver. There's this sense there is something deeper which somehow we want to find. Now, writers of the Enlightenment were very negative about this, seeing, in effect, religion as being something that was imposed on people. But other writers were not so sure. For example, Pascal talks about this deep abyss within human nature, which only God is able to satisfy, and nothing else is able to meet this deep sense of existential emptiness within human nature. Those of you who read C.S. Lewis will know all about this, because in many ways Lewis's story of movement from atheism to Christianity was of a growing realization that deep within him were some fundamental intuitions that, rationalism, atheism might be right, but it was imaginatively and emotionally unsatisfying. He talks about a glib and shallow rationalism, which never satisfied him. He believed it was right, but it did nothing for him. And he was requesting for something deeper that was also something that was true. Now, in recent years, this whole discussion has been taken in new directions. We have seen, for example, writers like Justin Barrett and others arguing that it is cognitively natural to believe in God or in gods. Now, I want to emphasize that this is really not saying this is right. He's not saying it's wrong. He's just saying this seems to be an observable aspect of the way in which human beings think. There's a natural cognitive propensity to move in this direction. Now, we mustn't exaggerate this or overinterpret this, but it does, I think, raise some very interesting questions. One of them might be this: if it is so natural to believe in God, what on earth does that tell us about the criticisms of the new atheism, which first of all tend to treat religion as something that is imposed on people who are naturally non-religious or even anti-religious, and secondly, of course, tend to argue that religion is only there because there are these people, these religious people, who in effect, to use Dawkins' rather interesting language, infect other people with these viruses about believing in God. It's a very intellectually unsatisfactory approach, but it seems to have excited some new atheist writers. But here is a point which I think is really important and which we might open up for wider discussion, and it's this: if it is natural to be inclined to believe in God? If it is human to be naturally inclined to believe in God, why do we use the word humanism to refer to a viewpoint which is atheistic or secularist? Why? Because those of your historians will go back to the period of the Renaissance. You'll think of writers like Lorenzo Valla, or perhaps better, Erasmus of Rotterdam. You will read them. You will notice they are humanists. They're proud of it. And they are religious believers who see their religious belief as bringing humanity to its proper destiny. In other words, if you say that human fulfillment is the ultimate goal of any humanism, then there is a Christian vision of humanism, and it's summed up in that quote from Augustine. This idea that our hearts are restless until we come to faith in God. And you could easily, as Erasmus does, articulate a Christian humanism, which is that to be truly human is to believe in God and know that you are loved by God. So why is humanism seen as an anti-religious movement? Well, many of you will know the answer. The answer lies in the early part of the 20th century, when humanism, which had previously been seen as a generalized viewpoint which said we need to maximize human potential, we need to maximize human fulfillment, and we recognize that there are many ways of doing this. It's a contested notion. Some are religious, some are secular. That all was taken away as a movement called secular humanism, especially in the writings of Paul Kurtz in North America, began to argue that it was only by the rejection of religion that humanity could achieve its true potential. And by one of those journalistic processes of simplification, secular humanism simply became humanism. What I want to say to you this morning is, we need to retrieve that word humanism in its proper sense, a neutral understanding that we are looking for something that allows human beings to achieve their true potential, and that Christianity has its own distinct vision of how it is that we achieve that potential. It's not about Christianity repressing people. That's an atheist or humanist, in that silly sense of the word, soundbite. Rather, it's about Christianity giving you a framework by which humanity is able to discover what we think its true potential is. And it seems to me we need to get a discussion underway here about what humanism is all about. And I will tell you off the record, except it's on the record now, that I had a very interesting conversation with one of the presidents of the British Human Association about this only a few months ago, and he felt this was a perfectly valid point. He was a secular humanist. He was perfectly prepared to accept that Christianity had its own distinct understanding about achieving human potential. So it seems to me there is something there that really needs to be followed through. So let me move on then and talk about something else. I want to come back to the whole question of ultimate questions, because these seem to me to be very important. You remember I quoted from José Ortega earlier in this lecture, in which I emphasized that these ultimate questions are very much there in human beings. And again, if you look at that quote on the screen, you'll see that he is affirming, as I do, the joy and wonder of science, while at the same time defining its limits. Now, many of you will know that there is a movement called Scientism. Again, Scientism, which in effect says reality is limited to what the scientific method can disclose. I want to say to you that's simply unacceptable. That for most of us, we would agree with the social psychologist Roy Baumeister, who says that to be human beings, to live authentic and fulfilled lives, we need theories of meaning, identity, agency, and purpose. Who am I? Can I make a difference? What is life all about? And Baumeister's point is that these are all non-empirical notions, which by definition have to lie beyond the scope of the scientific method. And Ortega is simply saying to us, look, science is wonderful, but it has its limits. But the point I want to emphasize to you is those limits define what is science. And reality is not limited to what science is able to investigate. Back to that image of John Wheeler, there is indeed a relatively small island of certainty and intellectual security, which actually is mostly driven by logic and by mathematics. But these big questions about life lie offshore, and you and I want to explore them and allow them to shape our lives. And that does not mean being irrational. Because we are human beings, we cannot avoid asking these ultimate questions. And that means that we're just not going to stop talking about God. Richard Dawkins, I think, has this idea that somehow cultural progress means that we're going to stop talking about God. It's not like that. What makes us stop talking about God is in effect exclusion from the media, a feeling of being intellectually inferior because we believe in God, or in effect not being allowed to talk about certain things in certain contexts. It's a social mechanism, not something that's intrinsic to us as human beings. And I think we need to get back to trusting in the Christian faith and realizing that it's something that needs to be heard. Now, my own view is that rationalism is deficient, but rationalism is not the same as being rational. Rationalism is this idea that somehow reality is limited to what human reason is able to prove. But I want to suggest to you that really is a very small world. One of my favorite writers in Oxford is Sir Isaiah Berlin, who died back in 1990. He was a brilliant intellectual historian and philosopher, very interested in ideologies, Stalinism, Nazism, and he wrote a series of books looking at this, and he made this point. When you look at the ideas human beings have entertained, they fall into three categories. Those that can be proved by logic, those that can be proved by science, and those that can be proved by neither of those methods. In the first category, we have the truths of logic and mathematics. In the second, we have scientific truths like the chemical formula of water is H2O. But here's the really interesting point. Berlin made the point that religious, anti-religious, moral, political views, in other words, the things that gave people their identity, all belonged in that third categories. And the key point that Berlin is making is this: the ways of thinking that make life worth living, that give us animation and direction, lie beyond the scope of logic and science. And Berlin says it is not irrational to entertain them, but because they cannot be proved, you need to be generous towards those who hold alternative perspectives. I don't believe Richard Dawkins has read Isaiah Berlin. He's an old-fashioned rationalist who somehow believes that reason is able to disclose everything that's able to know. But as most postmodern philosophers would tell you, in effect, reason very easily transitions from being a critical tool by which we look at the world to being a prison which limits us to what reason can prove. That's a very small world and a very existentially inadequate world. The poet Dante wrote about reason having short wings, and this, I think, is what he's getting at. Rationalism has difficulty in thinking about God. Here's a quote which I think will help make this clearer. This is from the British theologian William Inge, who died some time ago, but wrote a superb book in 1917 on the problems of rationalism. Rationalism, he says, tries to find a place for God in its picture of the world. In other words, it's like, God is a bit like a planet between Mars and Jupiter, or something that we can discover. But God cannot be fitted into a diagram. He is rather the canvas on which the picture is painted, or the frame in which it is set. However else you think of God, I know many of you will think of God as a living, loving, personal reality, and that's right. But this is also part of that rich vision of God, a God who we know, but who is also the ultimate foundation of the world, life, and ultimate reality. And that means you just cannot prove there is a God by some slick little rational means. We have to acknowledge there is a limit to what reason can disclose here. But it also means, very importantly, an insight you find in so many writings like, for example, Pascal and C.S. Lewis, that the deep structures of the world will bear witness to God. And that is why this dialogue between science and religion seems to me to be so important. Now, clearly, there are other things we could look at here. But I'm going, if I may, to return to this question of meaning. Many of you will know those very careful psychological studies which will show that people intrinsically search out meaning. They try to find a big picture. They try to ascribe meaning to events. They try, in effect, to make sense of their world and their lives using this category of meaning. And the classic example I suspect many of you will know about is the work of Viktor Frankl, who died in 1997, who was an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who was interned in some Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. And the observations he made, I think, remain a very powerful stimulus to our thinking on this matter. What he noticed was that those who survived in those concentration camps were those who were able to make some degree of sense of what was happening to them, who were able to articulate a framework of meaning which first of all interpreted their situation and then offered them the hope of transformation through it. And Frankl picked up on this idea you find in Nietzsche, that you can cope with any how if you have a why. And Frankl, I think, would now be seen simply as articulating a generalized insight, which is that a sense of meaning enables us to cope with so many traumas in life. I want to make a distinction between making sense of and coping with. To make sense of is in effect a cognitive thing. It's saying, look, I can see how this fits into a bigger pattern. That helps me make sense of that. But coping is something different. Coping is about existential accommodation. It's about getting through something because you can see it's leading you somewhere and that you will emerge from this a better person. And that seems to me to be very important indeed. And theories of meaning are basically to do with things that cannot really be investigated by the scientific method. Science is very good at telling us that meaning matters to us, but it doesn't help us figure out what that meaning actually is. Now, I mentioned Roy Baumeister a moment ago, and I'm talking about his very interesting book, which is called Theories of Life, where in effect he's asking what are the core features of any big picture, any theory of life, which makes it work. And he's not saying these are right. He's simply saying, as a psychologist, I observe these things. And he, in effect, talks about four core ideas: meaning, purpose, values, and a sense of efficacy. What's it all about? What is good, and how do I find it? What difference can I make? Do I really matter? These are questions we all ask ourselves from time to time. And Baumeister is saying we all need a framework of meaning that answers those questions in ways that satisfies us. And one of the points I make in this book, Inventing the Universe, is that we really need to ask what framework allows us not to invent these meanings, but to discern them. In other words, it's about saying this is not something I'm imposing on reality, it's something I'm discerning within reality. And my point to you is that Christianity gives you this big picture which enables you to do this. Now, I want to give time for some questions, so I'm now going to begin to summarize the main things I've been saying in this lecture. I began to discover the significance of Christianity 40 years ago. And it's been something that's stayed with me ever since. And one of the points I want to make in closing this lecture is that the personal integration of faith and science is really important. Some of you here today will not be scientists, maybe be in the humanities or medicine, in which case the personal integration of faith and medicine, or whatever, is your agenda. Because there are empirical studies that suggest that people very often judge a religion by how well the people they know are able to integrate things in their life and how this affects their behavior and their system of values. So I think it's something we need to bear in mind. Each of us has this responsibility, this privilege of thinking out, how am I going to bring together and hold together these two different aspects of my life? It's important to me, and I think also it could be important to you. And what I want to suggest to you is that that very old-fashioned narrative, science and religion are in conflict, are at war with each other, is simply inadequate. Long ago discredited by serious scholarship, but still repeated in the media. And I despair about this. I don't think we're ever going to be able to change this, but at least in our own lives, we can try and say we have found a way of bringing these together, which is not about conflict, but rather is about the enrichment of the quality of our lives. But the final point I want to make simply is this. Back to that image of the big picture. Psychologists tell us we need such a big picture. Christianity is about that kind of big picture. I quoted yesterday from C.S. Lewis, that very famous quote with which he ended a lecture given at Oxford in the 1940s, when he summarized what for him was the core compelling element of the Christian faith. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not simply because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. It gives you this viewpoint, this intellectual sun illuminating a landscape so you can see more clearly and you can see further. That's a big picture. And what I want to suggest to you is that that big picture holds together science and faith, but also, and this is how I end this lecture, gives us this understanding of human nature, made in God's image. And there's something about us which means we just can't stop thinking and talking about God. And I don't think the new atheism is ever going to be able to repress that. You and I need to figure out how we take that and use that in the preaching and ministry and apologetics of the churches. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.